The commercial break that changed everything. Ryan Clark did not lose his job in a quiet conference room. He did not receive a carefully worded email after the cameras stopped rolling. According to the accounts surrounding his ESPN exit, the former Pittsburgh Steelers safety learned that more than a decade at the network was ending while he was still working inside the building. In the middle of an NFL broadcast, one moment, Clark was analyzing football for a national audience. The next, executives were reportedly trying to reach him before the story escaped onto social media. By the time the commercial break ended, his future at ESPN had already changed. That detail is what transformed an ordinary corporate layoff into something far more uncomfortable. ESPN reportedly planned to speak with Clark the following morning, but media inquiries began arriving earlier than expected. The network feared he might discover the news from reporters or through a viral post, so producers moved quickly. Clark was informed during the show, left the set, and did not return to finish the broadcast. 11 years of work disappeared within the space of a commercial break. Then, before the sports world had fully processed Clark's departure, another major name was gone. Cam Newton, the former NFL MVP who had become a recurring voice beside Stephen A. Smith on First Take, was included in the next wave of cuts. ESPN had recently expanded Newton's role and positioned him as one of its most recognizable football personalities. Yet before the next NFL season could begin, he was out too. Two powerful voices, two sudden exits, less than 24 hours apart. But ESPN's biggest problem was not simply that Clark and Newton were leaving. The real danger came after they walked out the door. Neither man disappeared. Neither begged for another television contract. Instead, they began speaking through platforms they already owned, sending a message that reached far beyond one network. A company can cancel your contract, but it cannot cancel an audience that belongs to you. Where are you watching from today? Comment 1 if you believe athletes must build their own platforms. Or 2 if you believe traditional networks still hold the real power. Subscribe to the channel, because the reason behind these exits may be much bigger than ESPN wanted anyone to realize. Cam Newton refused to look defeated. Cam Newton's response did not sound like a man standing outside a locked door. It sounded like someone who had already built another entrance. When Newton addressed his ESPN departure on his own show, he did not launch into an emotional attack against the company. He acknowledged the opportunity, praised the experience, and then changed the meaning of the entire relationship. He described his time at ESPN almost like an internship, a place where a former quarterback who had never studied journalism could learn how television production, debate programming, branding, and media distribution actually work. That framing was more powerful than anger. Newton was essentially saying that ESPN had paid him while teaching him how to compete with ESPN. He had watched producers construct segments, seen how personalities were positioned, learned what made clips travel online, and observed how a major network converted controversy into attention. Then he carried those lessons back to 4th and 1, Funky Friday, and the growing media operation attached to his own name. His warning was direct. Personalities who do not own a platform risk being overlooked, replaced, or forgotten when the next round of restructuring begins. Awards cannot guarantee safety. Ratings cannot guarantee loyalty. Even a multi-year contract can become vulnerable when a larger corporate strategy changes. Newton pointed toward other former athletes and commentators who survived television exits because they had already developed independent audiences. The message was not that ESPN had no value. He repeatedly made clear that it remained one of the most influential platforms in sports. His point was more unsettling. Influence borrowed from a company is temporary. Influence built through your own audience can survive the company's decision. He also admitted the news affected him. The confident delivery did not erase the human reality that he had not expected the relationship to end so suddenly. But Newton refused to let rejection become the final interpretation of his experience. He left with knowledge, contacts, production experience, and an audience that could follow him somewhere else. That was the first major shift in this story. ESPN believed it was removing talent from its schedule. Newton treated the moment like graduation. And once he turned his attention toward Ryan Clark, the conversation became even more dangerous for the network. Ryan Clark is going to be okay. Cam Newton understood exactly why Ryan Clark's exit looked devastating. Clark had spent years becoming one of ESPN's most visible NFL voices. He appeared across multiple programs, argued with confidence, challenged conventional opinions, and built a reputation as someone willing to speak with the authority of a former player. To many viewers, ESPN and Ryan Clark had become almost inseparable. Newton rejected that idea immediately. He argued that Clark would survive because the pivot was not going anywhere. Clark's podcast, created outside ESPN with Channing Crowder and Fred Taylor, had already developed its own audience, identity, guests, and distribution system. In Newton's view, ESPN could remove Clark from NFL Live, but it could not remove him from the media landscape. Then Newton applied the same logic to himself. His departure might look unfortunate to people watching from the outside, but he still had 4th and 1. He still had Funky Friday. He still had cameras, microphones, production relationships, and millions of people who recognized his voice without needing an ESPN logo behind him. That was the real warning. Newton was not threatening a lawsuit or promising revenge. He was making a calm public statement about leverage. For decades, television networks held enormous control because athletes and analysts needed access to their studio, distribution, and audiences. Losing a position at a major network could feel like losing the ability to remain relevant. But that system has changed. Clark and Newton had built their escape routes before they knew they would need them. Their podcasts were not desperate projects created after the layoffs. They already existed. Their audiences already knew where to find them. Their brands could continue speaking without waiting for another executive to approve the subject, the tone, or the guest. That reality weakens one of the most powerful tools any network has over its talent: fear. A commentator who believes one company controls his future may avoid difficult negotiations. He may soften criticism, remain silent about internal problems, or accept decisions he dislikes. But a commentator with a profitable independent platform can walk away and continue broadcasting the next morning. Newton's confidence, therefore, carried a message to every athlete entering sports media: build the platform before the emergency. Do not wait until the contract disappears. But while Newton was turning his exit into a business lesson, Clark was facing a more personal fight. The public story about why ESPN released him was beginning to form, and Clark did not agree with it. The Peter Schrager incident returned, months before Ryan Clark's departure. A tense exchange with Peter Schrager had already created controversy inside and outside ESPN. During a discussion involving CeeDee Lamb and the Dallas Cowboys, Clark told Schrager that his perspective reflected the non-player in him. Schrager pushed back, believing his credibility was being diminished because he had never played in the NFL. The disagreement quickly became uncomfortable. Clark asked Schrager not to become angry and to allow him to finish. But viewers had already formed their opinions. Many believed Clark had crossed a line. The criticism was immediate because the exchange touched a sensitive issue in sports media. Former athletes often bring experience that traditional reporters cannot duplicate, but reporters and analysts spend years studying the game, building sources, and developing expertise. Telling someone that he sees football differently because he never played can be interpreted as content. It can also sound like an attempt to disqualify his opinion. Clark later acknowledged that the interaction had gone too far. He apologized to Schrager, accepted responsibility with ESPN leadership, and publicly committed himself to greater professionalism and teamwork. The two men continued appearing together, and a visible gesture of unity suggested the situation had been resolved. Then Clark was fired almost immediately. The old disagreement returned as a possible explanation. Reports suggested that ESPN executives had become frustrated with Clark's conduct and that the Schrager exchange contributed to the deterioration of his relationship with management from the outside. The story appeared simple. Clark embarrassed a colleague on television. Executives remembered it, and months later, the network moved on. Clark strongly disputed that interpretation. On the pivot, he insisted that he and Schrager did not have an ongoing personal conflict. He argued that he had treated Schrager respectfully after the incident and believed Schrager would confirm that their relationship had improved. Clark also said the original exchange had been misunderstood. He claimed he was not saying Schrager lacked the right to speak. He was saying that a person who never played might naturally interpret a situation differently from former players. Whether viewers accepted that distinction depended largely on how they already felt about Clark. But Clark's defense did not stop with the televised disagreement. He began describing tensions behind the scenes, including frustrations over which ESPN programs he was allowed to appear on, and why other personalities seemed to receive opportunities that he was told were unusual. Then he introduced an allegation that made the story significantly darker. Clark questioned what happened behind the camera. Ryan Clark suggested that the most damaging part of the Peter Schrager dispute may not have been what viewers saw live. It may have been what happened during the break. Clark claimed producers possessed footage of the two analysts continuing their disagreement away from the official broadcast. According to his account, concerns were raised that the exchange could become aggressive. Even though Clark rejected the idea that he intended to threaten anyone, he later questioned how details or images from that private moment reached outside media. The implication was serious. Clark was not simply arguing that ESPN had misunderstood him. He appeared to suspect that someone connected to the network helped shape the public explanation for his exit by allowing internal material to reach people outside the company. That claim has to be treated as Clark's allegation rather than an established fact, but it changed the emotional direction of the story. If his suspicion were accurate, the issue would no longer be only about a network choosing not to renew or retain an employee. It would become a question of whether a company protected its talent while preparing to separate from him, or whether private footage was allowed to strengthen a narrative that made the decision easier to defend publicly. Clark also acknowledged another source of tension: his willingness to discuss contract negotiations in public. When his earlier ESPN agreement approached expiration, he openly referenced the uncertainty surrounding his future. That type of transparency may appeal to fans, but executives often dislike negotiations becoming public because it reduces their control over the process. Viewed together, several pressure points had accumulated. There was the televised clash with Schrager. There were frustrations over program appearances. There were public comments about contract negotiations. There was Clark's strong personality and refusal to behave like a replaceable employee. There was also the network's much larger need to reduce overlapping roles following a major NFL media transaction. Any one of those factors might not have ended the relationship. Combined, they created a situation in which Clark became both expensive and difficult to control. Still, his public reaction remained surprisingly measured. He expressed compassion for other employees who had lost their positions and avoided turning every appearance into an attack on ESPN. At the same time, he refused to accept a version of events he believed was incomplete. His message was clear: the company might explain why it removed him, but it would not have exclusive control over his story. Then Deion Sanders entered the conversation, and he showed far less restraint. Deion Sanders put ESPN on trial. Deion Sanders did not react like a neutral observer. He reacted like someone who believed ESPN had removed two of the most valuable personalities on its football roster. Sanders publicly praised Ryan Clark and questioned how the network could allow him to leave while retaining other voices. Sanders considered less compelling. He also expressed disbelief over the reports involving Cam Newton, because Sanders had personal relationships with both men and enormous visibility of his own. His comments carried more weight than a typical reaction from social media. This was not just a retired player defending friends. Sanders was a nationally recognized coach, a Hall of Fame personality, and someone who understood the modern relationship between sports and entertainment. His criticism challenged ESPN's judgment at the exact moment the company was attempting to present the layoffs as a logical consequence of organizational integration. The network's corporate explanation centered on structure. After absorbing major NFL media assets, ESPN needed to evaluate teams, resources, contracts, and overlapping responsibilities. Executives described difficult decisions, future positioning, and support for affected employees. Sanders focused on talent. From his perspective, Clark brought credibility, energy, and a willingness to create debate. Newton brought celebrity, unpredictability, humor, and the type of personality that could turn a routine football conversation into a viral segment. Removing both men might make financial or organizational sense on a spreadsheet, but television is not watched by spreadsheets. The reaction among fans exposed an even deeper divide. Supporters argued that Clark and Newton were authentic voices who refused to become polished corporate product. Critics accused them of being loud, polarizing, or too willing to turn football discussions into personal arguments. Some celebrated the departures. Others believed ESPN was stripping away the personalities who made its programming worth watching. The debate quickly became uglier than the original business story. Personal attacks, accusations about motives, and long-standing cultural grievances flooded the conversation. The layoffs became a battlefield for people who had already chosen sides based on how they viewed Clark and Newton before the news broke. That polarization revealed why ESPN's decision was so complicated. Controversial personalities can frustrate audiences, but they also generate attention. Viewers who claim to dislike them often continue watching, reacting, sharing clips, and arguing about every statement. ESPN may have reduced internal conflict. It may also have released two men whose ability to create conversation was more valuable than the company realized. And the strangest part was that Clark and Newton had not always been allies. Former rivals found a common enemy. Ryan Clark and Cam Newton had publicly clashed before their ESPN exits. One of their most visible disagreements involved Jalen Hurts. Newton produced a quarterback ranking that excluded the Philadelphia Eagles star, and Clark strongly challenged the decision. The debate became personal when Clark referenced Newton's own playing career while defending Hurts, leading Newton to believe the criticism had moved beyond football analysis. The exchange created real tension. Newton responded publicly. Clark later attempted to reduce the hostility and emphasized respect for both Newton's accomplishments and Hurts' success. The disagreement eventually cooled, but viewers remembered it. These were not two friends who always protected one another. They were strong personalities capable of attacking each other's opinions in front of millions of people. That history made Newton's defense of Clark more meaningful. When Newton said Clark would be okay, he was not simply repeating a public relations message for a close ally. He was recognizing a larger truth that applied to both men. They could disagree about football, quarterbacks, media behavior, or professional boundaries, but they now faced the same system. Both had been valuable when their personalities produced ratings. Both became removable when corporate priorities changed. Both discovered that years of visibility inside a powerful company did not guarantee another season. Their unity therefore felt less manufactured. They did not need to pretend their history had been perfect. In fact, the past conflict strengthened the message. If two men who had publicly criticized each other could agree that athletes must own their platforms, then the warning was bigger than personal loyalty. The changing media economy had created an unusual alliance. Clark represented the experienced analyst who built credibility through detailed football discussion and difficult interviews. Newton represented the celebrity quarterback who understood spectacle, personality, and viral attention. Their styles were different, but their survival strategy was the same. Build something outside the network before the network decides you no longer fit inside it. That strategy also changed how audiences interpreted the layoffs. In another era, ESPN's decision might have ended the public relevance of both men. Viewers would have waited to see whether another network hired them. Their next opportunity would have depended on executives at Fox, CBS, NBC, Amazon, or another major company. Now the men could speak immediately. They could dispute reports, explain their emotions, interview guests, and monetize the attention created by their own dismissals. ESPN had ended two contracts. It had not ended either conversation, and that may have exposed the real weakness behind the network's enormous NFL expansion. ESPN grew bigger but lost control. The layoffs were connected to something much larger than two personalities. ESPN had expanded its position in NFL media, taking on major assets, programming responsibilities, and talent relationships connected to NFL network operations. Growth at that scale creates duplication. Two companies may have analysts covering the same subjects, producers performing similar jobs, and personalities competing for limited airtime. From the corporate perspective, cuts were almost inevitable. Executives could argue that the network was not targeting Clark or Newton personally. It was integrating a complicated operation, reducing overlap, and preparing a new structure for the future. That explanation may be financially reasonable. It does not make the human impact disappear. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. ESPN was becoming more powerful within NFL media while releasing some of its most recognizable football voices. The company had acquired more content, more rights, more infrastructure, and greater influence. Yet the same process made established employees vulnerable. In other words, the network grew stronger while individual workers became less secure. Cam Newton recognized that contradiction and turned it into his central lesson. A person can work for the largest platform in sports and still be one meeting away from losing access to it. The bigger the company becomes, the easier it may be for decision makers to view employees as overlapping assets instead of human beings with history, loyalty, and audiences. Ryan Clark's experience intensified that feeling. Whether he was released primarily because of restructuring, executive frustration, contract considerations, or a combination of factors, the timing made the process appear cold. A man who had spent years helping ESPN explain the NFL was reportedly told his run had ended while he was still appearing on an NFL program. Corporate language cannot fully soften that image. Words like integration, efficiency, alignment, and future positioning sound professional in a memo. They sound different to the person collecting his belongings after learning he will not return to the studio. The network still possessed enormous reach. Clark and Newton never denied that, but their exits proved that reach and control are not the same thing. ESPN could control its schedule. It could decide who sat at the desk. It could restructure contracts and replace familiar faces. What it could no longer control was where those faces went next, or what they told the public once they arrived there. That battle over narrative became the most important competition in the entire story. The network lost the final word. Years ago, a network usually controlled both the employment decision and the explanation that followed it. A commentator disappeared from television. A short statement thanked him for his service. And the audience received little more than carefully managed language. Ryan Clark and Cam Newton destroyed that old model. Clark had the pivot. Newton had 4th and 1 and other independent programs. Each man could respond in his own words, at his own pace, without being interrupted by a host or limited by a commercial break. They could describe the emotional reality, challenge, reporting, defend colleagues, and transform the layoffs into content watched by the same audience. ESPN had spent years helping them build. That is why their departures became more than an internal personnel story. ESPN said restructuring. Newton said education and ownership. Clark said the public explanation did not capture the full truth. Deion Sanders said the network had released elite talent. Fans argued over professionalism, authenticity, race, loyalty, and whether former athletes deserve greater authority in football conversations. Every version competed for attention. The network no longer had the loudest voice simply because it owned the largest studio. Clark's position was not that every decision made against him was unfair. He had apologized for the Schrager interaction and understood why his behavior created criticism. Newton did not claim ESPN had given him nothing. He openly admitted the network taught him valuable lessons and gave him access to the highest level of sports television. Their message was more mature and more threatening than simple revenge. They were saying that gratitude does not require dependence. An athlete can appreciate a company and still prepare for life without it. A broadcaster can make mistakes and still refuse to surrender control of his reputation. A network can provide opportunity without owning the person forever. That lesson will travel far beyond Clark and Newton. Current players are watching. Retired stars considering television careers are watching. Young commentators who believe a major network represents permanent security are watching. So are executives who now understand that releasing a personality with an independent audience can create a competitor overnight. ESPN may continue dominating NFL coverage. Its reach, resources, and brand remain enormous. But Clark and Newton exposed a limit to that power. The company could remove their names from the programming schedule, yet it could not force them into silence. The next stage will determine who truly benefited from the separation. ESPN will test whether replacement voices can maintain attention. Clark and Newton will test whether their independent platforms can turn controversy into lasting businesses. One side owns the network. The other side may own the relationship with the audience. The real power was never the desk. The biggest lesson from Ryan Clark and Cam Newton's exits is not that ESPN suddenly became weak. It is that the definition of power in sports media has changed. ESPN still owns enormous reach, premium rights, production resources, and access to the biggest games in football. But Clark and Newton proved that a network can control a television slot without controlling a career. That distinction matters more now than ever. Strategically, both men made the same smart move long before the layoffs arrived. They built independent platforms while they still had national visibility. Clark invested in the pivot. Newton developed 4th and 1 and continued expanding his personality beyond traditional television. Those decisions created leverage. But more importantly, they created protection. The lesson for athletes is simple. Do not wait until retirement to think about your second identity. Learn production, understand business, build relationships directly with your audience, use major networks as opportunities. But never assume any company will protect your future more carefully than you will. The lesson for networks is equally important. Talent is not just a name on a contract. Viewers form emotional connections with personalities. And those connections can leave the building when the personality leaves. Treating people with dignity is not only the humane thing to do, it is also a long-term business strategy. Clark's story also reminds us that accountability and self-defense can exist together. A person can admit when a televised exchange became too personal while still challenging an explanation he believes is unfair. Newton's response shows that disappointment does not have to become bitterness. He chose to frame his experience as education rather than humiliation. That may be the healthiest conclusion to this entire controversy. Careers change, companies restructure, relationships end, but none of those moments require revenge. Hatred. or permanent hostility? The strongest response is to learn, prepare, remain disciplined, and create something that cannot be taken away by one executive decision. ESPN will continue. Ryan Clark will continue. Cam Newton will continue. The real question is, which side will build more trust with the audience from this point forward? Comment 1. If you believe independent platforms are now the future of sports media. Or 2. If major television networks will always hold the advantage. Like this video, share it with another NFL fan, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about football, power, business, and the drama happening beyond the field.